Have you ever sacrificed your own principles just to be accepted, praised, or respected by someone else? The exact moment you become desperate for another person's applause, you silently surrender the keys to your own mind. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "He who relies on the approval of others has sold his soul to a stranger." Seeking validation is the quietest, most lethal poison. It makes you look powerful on the outside while rotting you from within. But what happens when you conquer the entire world, yet remain weak enough to kneel just to be accepted by your enemies? Now, let me take you to the bloody battlefields of the 19th century, into the shadow-drenched palaces of Europe, to the very birthplace of Napoleon Bonaparte's inferiority complex.
Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the small, impoverished island of Corsica to a family far removed from noble blood. When he entered the French military academy, the children of the aristocracy mocked him daily for his thick accent and his poverty. Their arrogant stares carved an unyielding rage and a desperate need to prove himself deep into young Napoleon's soul. In those cold hallways, he swore not only to conquer the world, but to force those very nobles who looked down on him to bow. While Marcus Aurelius taught that a mind should remain immune to external insults, Napoleon did the exact opposite. He built a colossal empire fueled by resentment. When he stepped onto the stage as an artillery officer at the siege of Toulon, his military genius left everyone breathless. As he shattered the Austrian armies in the Italian campaign, he dismantled centuries of aristocratic military doctrine with a single stroke. On the battlefield, he was a cold-blooded genius, making decisions under heavy fire, appearing like a god to his men. Yet behind every victory was a desperate child looking into the eyes of the Paris high society, asking, "Do you see me now?" His triumphs, instead of satisfying his hunger for approval, acted like gasoline poured onto an open flame.
In 1804, when he snatched the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head at Notre Dame, he believed he had proclaimed his legitimacy to the world. He was no longer just a general. He was Napoleon, Emperor of the French. But that golden crown could neither calm the storms in his head nor erase the deep-seated feeling of inadequacy. The ancient monarchies of Europe never viewed him as a true emperor. Behind his back, they mocked him as a Corsican usurper. Stoic philosophy teaches never to measure your worth by another's title. Yet Napoleon spent his life chasing an invisible title in the eyes of his enemies.
At the Battle of Austerlitz, he reached the absolute pinnacle of his military genius, crushing the Russian and Austrian emperors in the foggy plains. In what became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, he brought Europe's oldest dynasties to their knees. But Napoleon's true tragedy began right here, in the immediate aftermath of this monumental victory. Instead of completely obliterating them, he waited for their respect, their legitimacy, and their acceptance as an equal. The desperate desire for validation from his enemies became the ultimate poison of his triumphs. He convinced himself that to be accepted as a legitimate ruler, he needed a wife of noble blood to produce a royal heir. When his great love, Josephine, could not give him a child, he cast his heart and pride aside to divorce her. He practically begged to marry Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor, the very enemy he had repeatedly humiliated on the battlefield. Marcus Aurelius warned, "He who craves applause is a merchant trading his soul." Napoleon was blind enough to believe that diluting his bloodline with enemy royalty would finally grant him the validation he craved. When he married the Austrian princess, he celebrated a hollow victory, believing he was finally part of Europe's old aristocracy. Yet in the dark corridors of the palace, Marie-Louise and the nobles secretly despised him, enduring this Corsican peasant only out of sheer necessity. To gain the approval of his new wife and her royal family, Napoleon began making tactical compromises, softening his ruthless edge. In his desperate bid to be accepted in the palaces of his enemies, he slowly bled out the uncompromising spirit that made him Napoleon. Validation had become a heavier chain than any defeat.
In 1812, when he marched into the vast Russian wastes with over 600,000 men, his goal was not merely territorial conquest. He wanted to force Tsar Alexander to respect him, to bring him back to the negotiating table, and to validate his legitimacy. But the Russians denied him both a decisive battle and the diplomatic recognition he sought. They simply retreated, burning Moscow to the ground. Standing amidst the ashes of Moscow, Napoleon waited weeks for a peace letter from the Tsar. The addiction Marcus Aurelius warned about had made Napoleon irrational enough to abandon his army to the brutal Russian winter.
The freezing winds and ice-bound rivers of Russia transformed Napoleon's grand army into a procession of ghosts. As hundreds of thousands of soldiers perished from cold, starvation, and Cossack raids, Napoleon was still obsessed with preserving his prestige. The dispatches sent back to Paris didn't detail the destruction of his army. They emphasized that the emperor's health is excellent. To him, the lives of hundreds of thousands were far less valuable than a scratch on his public image. The desperate need for approval can turn a leader into a monster, completely blind to reality.
Seeing Napoleon weakened after the Russian disaster, his old enemies instantly united against him. The cruelest blow came from his own father-in-law, the Emperor of Austria, the very man whose family Napoleon had compromised everything to join. The aristocrats he traded his pride to appease stabbed him in the back at the very first opportunity. Marcus Aurelius was right. The man who surrenders his worth to the judgment of strangers will inevitably be sacrificed by them. By the time Napoleon realized that the royal approval he sought was a lie, it was far too late.
Forced to abdicate in 1814, he was exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. The man who once ruled Europe was now playing emperor in a miniature kingdom of a few square miles. Yet the humiliated child within him remained unsatisfied. He desperately needed to prove to the world that he was not forgotten. Escaping the island with a few hundred loyal soldiers, he gambled everything in a desperate return to France. He had one single obsession: to scream his greatness into the faces of European kings one last time.
When he set foot in France, the people and the army carried him back to Paris on their shoulders, a massive, intoxicating dose of validation. But the kings of Europe refused to see him as a sovereign ruler. They branded him an outlaw. In the summer of 1815, amidst the mud of Waterloo, he faced the combined British and Prussian armies, knowing he was playing his final act. On the battlefield, his legendary composure was gone. Plagued by panic, he threw his men into suicidal charges. When your mind is hijacked by what will they think, even the greatest genius is doomed to fatal error.
At Waterloo, as the British lines held firm and the Prussian army emerged from the flank, Napoleon's last illusions sank into the mud. When his invincible imperial guard finally broke and retreated, the hollow fortress of his legitimacy collapsed forever. Fleeing the field, he left behind tens of thousands of corpses and a shattered dream. When Marcus Aurelius wrote,
He who measures his victory by the admiration of others is destined to sink into the mire. He was describing Waterloo. Napoleon was definitively defeated before the very monarchies whose approval he had chased his entire life.
This time, the British ensured there would be no escape, imprisoning him on St. Helena, a barren volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Confined to a damp, dark house under the constant gaze of British guards, his downfall was absolute. The man who once commanded kings now threw childish tantrums because the British governor refused to address him as emperor. When referred to merely as General Bonaparte, he would fly into rages, locking himself in his room for hours. The great Napoleon had become a slave to a single word spoken by a low-ranking officer on a desolate island.
He spent his final years on St. Helena, dictating memoirs, desperately trying to rewrite history and justify his actions to posterity. To the few loyal companions who remained, he rambled night after night about why he hadn't truly lost at Waterloo and why he was right all along. In the court of his own mind, he was begging for validation from future generations. Marcus Aurelius had exposed this trap millennia ago. To crave the praise of future generations is to seek existence in the dreams of strangers. It is meaningless and hollow.
When you contrast Napoleon with Marcus Aurelius, the thin line between true strength and hidden weakness becomes blindingly clear. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who ruled the known world, cast aside imperial luxury and public applause to seek truth within his own mind. Napoleon rose from an obscure officer to conquer Europe, yet could never quiet the insecure Corsican child craving acceptance. One died a philosopher, master of his own mind. The other died a prisoner to the opinion of others. Napoleon was not destroyed by Wellington's cannons, but by his own insatiable hunger for validation.
When he drew his last breath in 1821 in the damp rooms of St. Helena, neither his royal wife nor the European kings whose respect he sought were by his side. He died alone, abandoned, consumed by the very fire of his ambition. His lifelong obsession with being accepted cost the lives of millions and delivered him to a tragic end. The pursuit of validation is the ultimate psychological trap, capable of twisting immense potential into utter ruin. Napoleon fell into this trap, and despite conquering the world, he perished in the prison of his own ego.
Napoleon's life leaves us with a cold, undeniable truth. No matter how many victories you achieve on the outside, if you depend on the approval of others, you remain weak. True power is not measured by how many people you conquer, but by how little you care about their opinions. This is why Marcus Aurelius remains one of history's greatest leaders. He understood that seeking approval is a form of self-imposed slavery. Napoleon, despite the scale of his triumphs, became the ultimate victim of his own image.
Now, pause and look at your own life with cold objectivity. Whose validation are you currently chasing at the expense of your values, your time, or your character? Are you breaking yourself to impress a boss who doesn't care, a social circle that looks down on you, or someone who will never accept you for who you are? Even if you conquered the world like Napoleon, their opinion of you would never change. Living for another person's applause means handing the starring role of your life to a stranger.
As Marcus Aurelius asked, will you take control of your own mind, or will you walk blindly toward your own Waterloo in search of approval? The choice is always yours. You either define your own worth, or rot away under the fake titles granted by others. What about you? What was the biggest mistake you ever made just to get someone else's approval? And what did it cost you? Let's talk in the comments.